All right. So the topic of today's session is coaching techniques and how they differ from advising and counseling. And the reason that I am presenting on this topic today is because last year in the summer of 2021, I became what's called a board certified coach. And as Ami mentioned, I've been a career coach in the Center for Career Development for a couple of years now. And in the field of career coaching, there is not yet any sort of requirement for certification, unlike some other fields like counseling and social work and therapy and things like that. However, there are a lot of certifications that are starting to come out in the field of coaching. And so one of the things our staff did was we wanted to try some of them out. So we, a couple of our staff members became certified professional resume writers. A couple of us became certified career coaches. And in particular, I became a board certified coach, which is a credential that is offered by the organization called NCEE, the National Center for Credentialing and Education. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but anyway, they have this coaching certification that they offer that requires you to go through a training program first and then sit for the exam. And that is something that I was able to do last summer. So this session today is going to be largely built off of what I learned through the training program for coaching and what the exam was tested on or tested me on. And if anybody has more specific questions about the training program or the certification, I'm happy to answer those. But today we'll focus a little bit more on the content of coaching, counseling, and advising. So to give everyone a little bit more of an overview of what I'm going to be covering, I'm going to start by talking about advising, coaching, and counseling. What are the similarities? What are the differences between those areas? Then I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about coaching because that's what my certification was about. So I'm going to talk about the role of a coach and a coachee, or I'm going to be using the word student because we are all in the field of education to talk about the coachee. Then I'm going to go through different coaching models and different coaching techniques and give everyone who's here a chance to chat about those and ask questions, and then close with a little bit of information about ethics in coaching, which is very important and was a big part of the exam that I had to take. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. And if you have any questions throughout the entire session, feel free to either just unmute yourself and hop in, or my colleagues who are on the call are going to be watching the chat as well, and they can let me know if you have questions in the chat. So advising versus coaching versus counseling. Something I've noticed since I started working at UConn is that many students will use these terms interchangeably. And that's fine in some ways because they, if they need help with something, they're going to either a coach or an advisor or a counselor to help with whatever that is. But there are some nuances between the fields. And even if students don't recognize those as staff and faculty, if we do, that can be helpful in us better serving our students. So starting out, some of the basic similarities between these areas, this should not be news to anyone, but all three of these professions involve a relationship between two or more people. They all are designed to help people achieve their goals, usually based on some sort of advice or guidance or something like that. They are all scientifically backed methods based in theory. So it's not like things that we just kind of made up that we're running with. And then they all usually require either a master's degree or equivalent experience as a minimum qualification, because there are, elements of coaching and working with others that usually require either master's level education to kind of talk about what the nuances are, or experience that equates to a master's degree. But what I'm more interested in talking about today is some of the key differences between these three areas. And I'm going to focus on three main categories, one being the perspectives that are used in each of these approaches, two being why clients would come to somebody in any of these professions, and then three, who is kind of considered the expert and the leader in these scenarios. So getting things started, when it comes to perspectives, folks in the advising field tend to use both a past and future perspective when working with students. Folks in counseling tend to focus on the past, and folks in coaching tend to focus on the future. And let me dive into that a little bit further. So I'm going to start with counseling. In counseling, if you think about, what kind of media portrays as a typical counseling appointment, usually somebody is going in after they've experienced something that they need help processing. So a counselor is often looking kind of into that person's past, asking them questions about what happened, how it impacted them, how they're feeling about it now, and trying to process it that way. An advisor does some of that as well. An advisor definitely might ask people questions about, if we use, academic advising as an example, what courses a student has liked in the past, what, critical experiences they've had in the past that might impact their future trajectory, things like that. But advisors also need to ideate with students about the future, like where do you see yourself going? What major do you want to pursue? If you want to change your major, what direction you want to go? So advisors really kind of sit in the middle of these two areas. And the unique thing about coaching is that it is almost 100% future oriented. So coaching is all about asking your client or your student kind of where do you want to be and how can we get you there? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about like some models that help with that in the next couple of slides. So that's one of the key differences. Another key difference is why clients come to see you. So when you think about advisors, clients usually go to advisors when they have a very specific need. And in academic advising, it's usually an academic need. So that might be something like, I need to register for classes. I need to get this hold off of my account. I'm on probation and I need to get off probation. And they're coming to you to seek guidance on this very specific topic or question. In counseling, like I mentioned earlier, that is a field that usually is addressing something that has happened from the perspective of like fixing whatever that is. So if it's an experience that a student had in the past, they might go see a counselor to process through that experience and then hopefully be able to move forward from it. Coaching, based on that future orientation, is all about creating together. So a coach is going to work with a client to co-develop a plan or action steps to help them get where they want to be. So whereas advising is kind of very specifically oriented to address one particular topic and then move on, counseling is, that processing, moving forward from something that happened in the past. Coaching is really that, let's look forward and let's create a plan together to get there. And then lastly, one of the other key differences that was really emphasized in my coaching training is within each of these relationships, who is considered to be the expert. So when it comes to advising, the advisor is often seen as the expert. So for example, if a student comes to register for classes, the advisor knows what classes are being offered, when they're being offered, how to use student admin, how to use Husky CT. They are, the pro in all of those things, and they're going to be guiding the student through that entire process. Similar in counseling, a counselor is trained to help somebody process through something that happened to them. And therefore, they are going to be leading that conversation, asking questions that are directing the client in one way or another and really guiding the session. That is very different when it comes to coaching. So in coaching, the client is considered the expert and the leader of, how things work. So in a coaching session, the client will often come in and say, this is why I'm here. This is what I want to work on. And they will lead the conversation towards that topic, whatever it might be. And of course, the coach is going to come in and ask questions and, maybe give suggestions depending on the conversation, but the client is really in charge in this scenario. And they are considered the expert because the topic in this scenario, it really is themselves. So if there's kind of like this future version of themselves that they want to be, they're the expert on their skills, their abilities, and their motivation to become that person that they want to be. So there's a lot more detail that I could go into about some of the nuances between these areas, but these are really the three main themes that were emphasized in the board certified coach training. And I think this does help identify some of the key differences. So to solidify this a little bit further before we go into some more coaching details is I wanted to provide a super oversimplified example to identify the differences. So let's say, as a hypothetical scenario, a junior comes to an advising appointment with you and they express concern that they were planning to apply to medical school this upcoming cycle, but they don't feel their application is strong enough. And that's kind of the issue that they present to you in an advising or a coaching appointment. So in an advising setting, again, this is oversimplified. An advisor could take the approach of, sitting down with a student, reviewing their application, telling them what makes an application strong, and then making suggestions on how to make that application stronger. So they might say, take this class, take this summer course, do this particular student or organization or activity or internship or something like that, and really guiding them based on their own expertise from working with other students who are applying to med school. Flipping the approach, if we were to take a counseling approach to this scenario, a counselor might ask them some why questions. So why suddenly do you feel like your application is not strong enough? What happened? What changed? And what do you feel like you're missing that is giving you this pause on submitting your application? And a counselor might work through that, with like that past lens that we were talking about earlier, to hopefully get the student to rebuild that confidence and then be able to, move forward with submitting their application. A coach is going to sit between these two, in the sense that they are going to try to empower the student by allowing the student to process a little bit of what they've maybe done right or wrong in the past from their own perspective, and then also what they can do moving forward. So in a coaching scenario, you might ask the student, what do you think makes a strong medical school application? So rather than telling them, really asking their perspective. And if they say, I don't know, then you might ask them, well, how can you find out? What resources are out there, or what steps can you take to obtain that information, empowering the student to make that decision. And then once you're on the same page about what makes a strong application, then you can work with the student to co-create an action plan on how they can reach their definition of a strong application. So there's really not a lot of guidance in this scenario. It's more so asking questions and maybe directing towards resources, but the student is really making all the final decisions. That doesn't mean that you can't make any suggestions. So one example that I have in here is if a student says, well, I think that a really strong med school application is somebody that has 100 hours of clinical experience and I only have 20. You might ask them, well, have you considered taking a growth year or a gap year? And that isn't guidance necessarily, but it's truly a question that then the student can look into and decide if that's something that they want to consider. So I hope that this super oversimplified example really does emphasize the differences between these three areas. So because this is the foundation for today's conversation, I just want to pause and see if anybody has any questions before I move into a deeper dive of coaching and coaching techniques. All right, I don't see any questions at the moment, so we will keep on going, and then I'll just have my colleagues Jillian and Ami just let me know if you see questions coming. Okay, so again, deeper dive into coaching. Let's talk more about it. So when you're looking at a coaching relationship, you have the coach and the coachee, and for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to call them the coach and the student. And each of these two individuals has a different role in the coaching relationship. So when you look at the role of the student, like we said on the previous slide, the student is really considered the expert in this scenario and the leader of the relationship. So they are going to be choosing the focus of coaching. So if they have a specific concern on their mind or like a challenge that they're trying to overcome, they're going to offer that as the focus of your relationship. They're also going to decide on the time frame. They might come and meet with you once, they might meet with you for an entire semester, they might meet with you for their 4 years, maybe more than that years at the university. But it's up to them to decide, when they feel empowered enough to end that coaching relationship and continue on their own. And they are going to take the lead on developing the specific goals, strategies, and action steps that they're going to own in this relationship. That piece is really about giving the student ownership, because as we all know, if a student doesn't have ownership in a situation, it is unlikely for them to follow through on whatever that situation may be. So really giving them the ownership is important in this situation. So what is the role of the coach? Their primary role is to ask questions. I have found since I completed my coaching certification, when I'm meeting with a student, the 90% of the talking that I am doing is asking questions and really kind of guiding the student to develop their own answers rather than providing them with answers themselves. And I say here purposeful questions because there's definitely a difference between just asking random questions and asking purposeful questions. And we'll talk a little bit later about what makes a purposeful question. The other roles of a coach are keeping the coaching focused and holding the student accountable. So even though the student is going to lead the conversation and develop like their own goals for themselves, it's still very possible that they might veer off course and, get distracted or, not follow through on what they said that they were going to do. So it's a coach's responsibility to point that out to them, keep them on topic and keep them responsible to make sure that the relationship is progressing forward. So that's how the two individuals in this relationship tend to work together. Even if the coach and coachee are perfectly within those roles, it's not always going to go perfectly. There are a lot of barriers that could come up to coaching. And I think it's important to address those because coaching is not necessarily the best approach for every student. So resistance to coaching happens when a coach expects or pushes for change when a student isn't ready for that change, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And indicators of that can include interruptions, seeming distracted, or getting defensive. So going back to what I said on the previous slide, accountability is huge in coaching. Because the student is taking the lead, they really need to be the one to follow up on their actions and do what they say that they're going to do. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you will see students getting defensive or getting distracted based on questions you ask or recommendations you might make. So that is, an indicator of resistance. When you face resistance as a coach, it's important to identify the underlying cause of that resistance in order to effectively address it. And so some of the underlying causes we talked about in the training program I went through were lack of motivation. So if a student is working towards a goal that they don't actually care that much about, that lack of motivation can really get in the way. Indecisiveness. So if they're trying to make a really big decision and they are just in their head about it and cannot commit to something, that can often be a barrier to coaching as well, because it's going to be hard for them to move the needle if they feel not empowered enough to make a concrete decision. Dysfunctional myths could be getting in the way if they have like a really strong belief about something that they've like learned growing up, or maybe, a parent has told them, or, an advisor has told them in the past that's actually not true. That can be really derailing for them. Lack of information. If they're trying to make a decision and they just don't know the best plan because they're not aware of the options or what the options would entail, that can be a barrier. And then inconsistent information as well. So if they're working with a coach and an advisor and a family member, and they're all telling them different things, that can also be barriers to the coaching model because they don't necessarily know which information to follow in a situation like that. So at the end of the day, if you experience resistance and you can identify the underlying cause, the suggestion on how to respond to that is to avoid what we call the righting reflex. So oftentimes when we face one of these underlying causes, we want to like fix it. We want to say, oh, well, you're getting inconsistent information. Let me give you the right information. And just like cut that off right here, right now. Or if you have a dysfunctional myth, like, let me just tell you what's dysfunctional about that and give you more accurate information. But that isn't necessarily always the best approach in these scenarios. What is the best approach is more so helping the student process through the reason that they are experiencing this resistance or demonstrating this resistance, and then talking with them about what steps they need to take to not be so resistant. So if they're having a dysfunctional myth, maybe it's, last time you had a belief that was in contrast with what you wanted to do. How did you resolve that scenario? Can we mimic that process in this scenario? Or you're unmotivated. What happened the last time you were unmotivated about something? Can we learn something from that scenario to influence this scenario? So processing through it with them rather than just correcting it, and persuading the client is really the approach. And the last thing I want to mention in terms of like the different roles of the coach and coachee are this idea of developmental coaching. So coaching can be like a one and done sort of situation, or it can be something that happens over time. And if it's something that happens over time, like if it's a student you're working with for multiple sessions or multiple years, it's important to think about the developmental process that student is going through and not necessarily keeping them or letting them stay in the same place over a long period of time, if that makes sense. So the definition of developmental coaching is it involves helping a client navigate a major or minor transition that they're experiencing. So in the context of education, that could be graduating. It could also be something like moving to a new city, becoming a parent, something along those lines. And these are things that are not processed and done with in one day. So when you're using developmental coaching, it's just a little bit of a mindset shift where you want to pay attention to the growth of intellectual, emotional, or other capacity over time, rather than just kind of addressing the issues at hand in a quick way, like something like registering for classes. And really plan for this to be a long-term relationship and kind of like check in over time so that you are feeling like you as the coach and that the client/student is making progress over that course of time. Here, the coach's aim is really to support the client to make changes necessary to grow and mature. And I think that this is really important to mention because college students are in such a crucial period of their lives where they're growing and maturing. So thinking about developmental coaching as we work with them is really important. Okay, so that was the beginning of the deep dive into coaching. Are there any questions about any of those concepts before we move into coaching models? No. All right, then let's continue diving in. So coaching models. This portion of the presentation has a lot of like images and flow charts and things like that. I will send a copy of the slides afterwards so that you can have them, but just as a heads up. So when we talk about coaching models, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context. So think about like the history of coaching, how it was developed, and what are some of the foundational concepts it was based on. So starting off with history, the earliest uses of the word coach come from an athletic setting, which makes sense. Athletic teams have coaches, and coaches are people who work with athletes over time to help them improve their athletic ability. So that concept was then, transferred into other fields as well, which now we have life coaching, executive coaching, career coaching, all the different types of coaching. The first published definition of the word coach was in the Oxford Dictionary in 1830. So we're talking quite a while ago. And it read, slang for a tutor who carries a student through an exam, which I think is a really interesting definition because it's, the carrying a student, I guess, image isn't something that really resonates anymore, but it does, I guess the underlying meaning of that still rings through. So we are trying to give the students a tool to be successful in some way. And in this case, it's, getting them through an exam. The concepts that were at the beginning of the coaching profession are the four that you see here. So it was based originally in Freudian thought that the truth is in our subconscious, and that as long as a coach is able to like ask the right questions and have an in-depth conversation with a client, the client will be able to kind of like discover that information within themselves. I know that Freudian thought has been contested a bit, but still think it's important to mention that that was one of the foundations. Humanistic perspective. So acknowledging the fact that humans have free will and can make their own decisions in their own best interest and, work towards self-actualization to create meaning in their lives and things like that. Behavioral perspective, meaning that all behavior is learned or unlearned, so that, if a student isn't exhibiting a certain behavior that they should be right now, that's changeable. And also if they're exhibiting a behavior that's maybe not the best for their journey, that is unlearnable as well. And then lastly, transpersonal perspective, meaning that coaching involves a holistic approach, mind, body, spirit, and every other element of who humans are. So I'm going to show 3 models on the next 3 slides, and those are all, evolved versions of these 4 concepts joined together. So the first model is the GROW model. And this one is, I would say, one of the most common coaching models, at least in my experience and what I learned from my coaching program. And the GROW model stands for goal, reality, options, and will do, or some people also call it way forward. And the GROW model implies that when you start with a client, you're kind of in this G zone where you're developing and setting a goal with them. And the coaching process is meant to take them through all the other letters. So the R, the O, and the W. So to go over them briefly, the G stands for goal, and that is at the beginning of your relationship with a client, you are going to set a goal or outcome for the coaching session or the coaching relationship. So the student is going to come in and say, this is what I want to work on, this is what I want to solve, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to be in the future, and that's kind of the focus of your relationship. The R is where the kind of self-reflection piece of the coaching process can come into play, because in the reality phase, the coach helps the client assess their current situation and what maybe is presenting as an obstacle for moving themselves forward. So as we talked about earlier, with your student, you have the current version of the student and the goal of where the student wants to be in the future. And this reality piece is helping them figure out, like, what's the difference between where I am today and where I want to be in the future, and what's preventing me from being there. So assessing that is really important. Options are exploring ideas and brainstorming ideas on how they could surpass those obstacles and get to where they want to be. So this is really kind of a brainstorming phase, get everything on the table, make sure there's multiple ideas under consideration. And then the W, the will do, or the way forward, is helping the client actually choose and commit to the action that they want to take moving forward. So of the options, pick one or pick a couple that the client is going to work on. So this model, I think, sounds fairly simple when you talk through it in this way, but it can, manifest in a lot of different ways when you're actually working with a student or a client. But I do think that this way of thinking about things, where there's the goal, the assessment of reality, the brainstorming of options, and then the deciding on the way forward, is a process that does work very well for a coaching approach. All right. I'm going to move on to the second model, but happy to answer questions about any of them. But I wanted to provide multiple options so you could see how different people approach the coaching process. So our second model is called the intentional change theory. And apologies if this graphic is a little bit blurry. Couldn't find a better one. But this model also is built off the idea that as a client in a coaching, that a client in a coaching relationship has an intentional change that they want to make. So in this process, step 1 up here in the top red hexagon, you as the coach will help the client assess their ideal self. So brainstorm, what does my ideal self look like, in as much detail as possible. And the more they're able to describe that, the better, because then you kind of know what you're working towards. Number 2 is then you reel it back in and identify the real self. And again, do some of that reflection of, where am I right now? What are my skills, qualifications, obstacles, things like that. Then after you do the assessment of your ideal self and real self, then you turn to thinking about your strengths and your gaps. So comparing your ideal self to your real self, what are the strengths that you have that are maybe similarities between those two versions of yourself, and where are the gaps? What are the gaps that you need to fill? Then after that, like, very much reflection heavy phase. Then you move a little bit more into the action planning phase, where step 3 here is identified as a learning agenda. So identifying, what are the things I need to learn along the way in order to become my ideal self. Number 4 is experimenting and practicing those things. And then step 5, which is actually, I don't know if I would call it a step because it's kind of in the middle, is the coach is providing support throughout this entire process. So, they're going to help do that initial reflection. They're going to help develop the learning agenda. They're going to help guide you towards resources to experiment and practice. And then they're also going to help you do some reflection to see, did that work? Did our process work? Did our plan work? And if not, let's continue to go through this cycle until it does. So similar foundational concepts to the GROW model, just articulated in a little bit of a different way. Okay, and then the last model that I'm going to show today is called the appreciative inquiry model. And this model is largely based on the field of like positive psychology. So if some of you are familiar with that field, you might notice some connections here. But this specific framework is also sometimes referred to as the 4 Ds because it stands for discovery, dream, design, and destiny. And again, you'll notice a similar theme here. So in the discovery phase, it's described as a grounded exploration of the best of what is. So assessing where like a client is currently and identifying the strengths, the high points of that. Step 2 is dream. So visioning the future and collaboratively articulating like what might be. So that's kind of like the ideal self from the previous model. Step 3 is designing. So working on the steps to get to the what might be version of yourself. And then destiny is experimenting with what can be, and then, learning from that experience and kind of doing it again. So, in my experience, sometimes I will, if I'm working with a student who really resonates with like models and theories, I might actually show them one of these and say, you are at this point in the process right now based on our conversation, and this is kind of the process that we're trying to go through to show them what their relationship with me is going to look like. Other times, I think this might go completely over a student's head, so I don't even mention these terms, but I still kind of use the conceptual flow when I'm working with them. And the last thing I'll mention about these models is that sometimes all 4 of these steps can happen in 1 half-hour appointment, and other times this might not happen in a complete cycle until a year, a couple of years. It really depends on what the client's goal is, what their vision of their future self is, and their motivation, and actually follow through on the actions they can take to get there. All right, so I do have some discussion questions. I'll call these like discussion/reflection questions. If anyone would like to share their thoughts, happy to hear them. If you would rather just kind of think about it to yourself, also happy to have you do that. But my first question is, the 3 models I just showed are very similar, but I'm curious which model like most resonated with you as I was going through it, and why, because I know different models definitely resonate with different people. And then the second question is, how might different models apply differently with different students? I know the word different is in there 3 times, but I think that gets at the point that like there's not one coaching approach that works with every student. It really depends on them and who they are. So for example, how might your coaching approach work differently with a first-year student versus a senior or an alumni? And same thing, like if you're working with a student who has no idea what they want to do after graduation, or even what they want to study maybe at the university, versus a student who is like committed and has always been committed to a certain career path. So I'll wait a few minutes. If anybody does want to share, feel free to hop in. If not, I would encourage you to just think about those questions.
Lisa?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, so this is Jess. I was thinking that maybe the 4 Ds, that kind of resonated with me because it used the words collaboratively and collectively. And I kind of like the idea of, the coach taking part in that with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This model really emphasizes that it's a collaborative process, and it's not the coach making decisions, it's not the student making decisions themselves, but it is something that you can work on together. And I often find, at least for me personally, when a new student walks into my office, they don't really know that element of coaching. Like sometimes they're a little nervous to come in because they're like, I feel unprepared for this and I don't know, how I'm going to reach my goals. But then when we talk about the fact that it's a collaborative process, they tend to kind of calm down a little bit and are a little bit more open to our conversation. So that's a really good point about the collaborative piece being emphasized.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, any other thoughts on these questions? No worries if not. I know this is a lot of new information in a short time. So also, if you want to take some time to think about it, I'm happy to continue to chat with you after today's presentation about these different models. Okay, so as you are still processing through the coaching models conversation, I am going to move on to talk about some select coaching techniques. Now, this is another topic that I could probably talk about all day long. I did so many hours of training on these techniques, but I've chosen the ones that I would say I use most frequently to go over briefly with you today. So the very first, and I think there are four main techniques that I'm going to go through. So the first is called a SWOT analysis or a SCOO analysis. And this is a tool that some of you might be familiar with from like more of a corporate or a business setting. I know that this is often used by organizations to identify like their goals and plans moving forward, but it can also be very effective to use with a student to help them identify their goals and plans moving forward. So what a SWOT analysis stands for is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the questions that you see here on this image are kind of like the prompts for having a student think about these four categories. So when you have a student think about their strengths, the question is, what do you do well? What are some of the assets that you bring to the table? When you think about weaknesses, it's where do you need to improve or where do you need to get better? Opportunities, what are your goals? What are the things you want to work on? And then threats, what obstacles are you going to face along the way? And this model seems pretty straightforward. Like these are some pretty, I would say, basic questions, but having them laid out like this is sometimes like so helpful to a student to actually like get their ideas on paper, or maybe if you do it digitally, like type them out, and then actually be able to see like, okay, these are my strengths and these are my threats. How can my strengths help me overcome my threats? Or, this is a weakness that I have, but how can I use one of my strengths to overcome that weakness, or something like that? Like it really helps them see the relationship. One kind of, I guess, key element of this this model is that the strengths and weaknesses boxes often focus on internal factors. So strengths are like things that you yourself as like a student, for example, are good at and can bring to the table. And weaknesses are things that maybe you're not so good at or you have improvement to work on. And then opportunities and threats are more external. So what are opportunities that are not within you that you can take advantage of or utilize? And then same thing for threats. What are some external factors that are pressuring you or preventing you from achieving your goals? And presenting it like that to students, I also find is really helpful. So moral of the story is this is a model that can really help students start out in the coaching process. Like if we go back to the 4Ds, like that, the discovery phase, doing some of this reflection, and then also the opportunities and threats can also start to go into the dream phase as well. I see a question in the chat about the SCOO or SCOO, as I learned it as, and that stands for strengths, challenges, opportunities, and obstacles. So it's just a different acronym that essentially stands for the same things, but I just know that some people like learn it one way and some people learn it the other way. So I just wanted to say that they're the same thing, they just have different titles. If your student resonates more with the word challenges than weaknesses, which I think there's some value in the nuance there. Like weaknesses, I think, are often seen as very negative, whereas challenges are seen as like things to overcome, and it's possible to overcome them. So that's a good question, Judy. I think knowing your student and maybe choosing the acronym that might work best for them would be my recommendation here. Okay. So the next approach that I want to talk about really quickly is reframing. And I think that this one is really important because when students are going through the coaching process for the first time, it can be a lot for them. So if this is the first time they're being asked, like, to lead the conversation and to lead the goal setting and to lead the action planning, they might say, whoa, like I am unprepared for this. I am underqualified for this. And I have had students do that, in my office. But if you are able to help them reframe some of those insecurities or concerns that they have, that can often empower them to better engage in the coaching process. So the definition of reframing is the process of helping a client shift their mindset so they're able to look at a situation, person, or relationship from a slightly different perspective. And when we're working with students, the key here is that oftentimes students, at least when they're coming to see us, are stuck in something called the blame frame, where they are problem oriented. They're saying, this is the problem that's preventing me from doing X, or I can't figure out how to solve this problem, or I don't know what to do, and that's a problem, so help me. This way of looking at things often makes students feel very helpless and focus on what is wrong, which can be very overwhelming and can really have an impact on their mental health if always what they're focusing on is problems and negativity and challenges. So from a coaching perspective, if we can shift their blame frame sort of idea or focus to what's called the outcome frame, that can be incredibly helpful. So the outcome frame is something that's solution oriented. It leads to students feeling capable and resourceful, and it focuses on possibilities. So you can see each of those things correlates directly with something from the blame frame. So to give an example of this, I was working with a student recently who came in and said, I have been applying to, 40 jobs. I graduated in, I'll use an alum as an example. I graduated in May. I've been applying to 40 jobs and I haven't heard back from a single company. And it's a problem because none of these companies like me and they're not, my resume is not resonating with them. And it's everything is going wrong. And my line of questioning was, well, what do you feel good about in the job application process? What do you think is going right? And we talked about that for a little bit. And then I said, okay. And the student mentioned that like they felt that their interviewing skills were really strong. And I said, okay, great. So it seems like that's a strength of yours, but the problem is that you're not always getting to the interview because your resume or your application isn't getting you there. So then we talked about how might you be able to use your interviewing skills to help strengthen your resume and your cover letter. And we kind of worked backwards from there because that was a strength that the student had. And long story short, at the end of the appointment, they left feeling a lot more confident that they would be able to take their storytelling ability from their interview and apply that more directly to their resume and cover letter, which hopefully will now resonate with more with employers. I can't report on the outcome of that scenario because that was just on Tuesday, but I hope that the student will, get back to me and say that that was kind of a helpful connection for them, where they were able to reframe how they were approaching that challenge they were facing. So that's an example of reframing. The best way to reframe is to ask questions and have the student think about possibilities and kind of go from there. Speaking of questions, that is the third strategy that I want to go over, and then we'll leave time for any questions that you all have as well. But questioning is often referred to as like the coach's most powerful tool. Because when you ask a question, the student or the client has to give an answer. And sometimes that answer is, I don't know, but at least you're getting them talking and contributing to the conversation. So The definition of questioning within the coaching context that I have from my training is the act of asking the client questions to learn more about what they're thinking and encourage them to think about things they haven't thought about before. So not just asking questions to ask questions, but asking purposeful questions, like that was on one of our previous slides. What are the characteristics of a purposeful or a good question? First off, open-ended. So if you ask a student a question like, have you considered a gap year before going to medical school? They could say yes or no, and then not elaborate. Instead, if you were to ask them, what are the pros and cons of taking a gap year before going to medical school? That's going to lead to a much more robust conversation and set you up to ask additional questions. So that having open-ended questions is very important. Also, making sure the questions are future-oriented is important as well. So when you're talking with a student about using the medical school example from one of our first slides today, not asking them questions about what do you wish you had done while you were still a student in terms of boosting your application, or what past experiences have you had that you are that you would have liked to spend doing something else instead. Like those sorts of questions are not necessarily going to help from a coaching perspective, but rather asking those questions about the future, like describe to me a strong medical school applicant, tell me about what you could do in the next week to boost your med school application. Things like that are always going to be more purposeful for the coaching approach specifically. And then lastly, the actual wording of the question is very important too. So coaching questions often start with how or what instead of why, because why questions are often the types of questions that make people feel defensive. So if you were to ask them like, why did you apply for 40 jobs so far? They might say, well, I thought that was how many I needed to apply for, or I found 40 jobs that I liked. Instead, if you were to ask them, what was your motivation for selecting these 40 jobs that you applied for, or something like that? Again, that's going to make them less defensive and open you up more to a conversation. So the key here is that how or what can really make a difference, and having the question be open-ended can be really helpful as well. One of the tools that they gave me in my coaching training was this list of fundamental coaching questions, and I have found it so helpful. So at its core, the field of coaching and the line of questioning can be summarized to what you see on this slide. So the questions are, what do you want? What can you do about that? What will you do about that? What resources will support you in that or support your goals? By when? How will you know that you have reached that goal? And how will I know that you have reached that goal? If a student can answer all of these questions, the likelihood of them achieving that goal is going to be very high, because they have such a concrete plan outlined based on the answers to these questions. I'm not saying that these questions are easy to answer, but these are questions that I always keep in my back pocket because they are very, very helpful for students setting goals and also holding students accountable. So highly recommend writing this down. Like I said, again, I will provide a copy of the slides so you can have them as well, but these are some of my absolute favorite questions. All right, so that is the end of the kind of coaching techniques that I wanted to go over today. So I do have another set of like discussion/reflection questions that I will again give you the chance to unmute if you would like to, or just think about. So question one are, what are some common questions that I ask in my current advising or teaching or coaching conversations with students now, and how might I be able to adjust those questions to lean more toward the coaching approach when that approach is the best approach for that student? And then going right along with that, question number two, in which situations would it be best for me to use a coaching approach within my job versus maybe an advising or a counseling approach? I'll give you a clue. There are no correct answers to either of these two questions. It's just something that I want everybody to think about for their own role and their own job. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about that.
So Lisa, this is Michael Cunningham. I advise individualized major students. And one of the things that sometimes can be difficult for them is to figure out what they want. And I often ask the question of, well, what are you interested in? And then they say everything. So I was just curious if you have any kind of more specific questions that you tend to ask. If I like your initial question of what do you want, but what if they don't know what they want? And what types of questions do you typically ask to help them to process a little bit more about what they might actually want?
Yes, that's a very good question and is super common in our office too. Like students will come in and say, I have no idea what I want to do career-wise. And I think that it's a little bit of a tricky situation because we as coaches or mentors or advisors, we don't know what's going on in their head. So like there is definitely something in there that they either want or don't want. Maybe they have like an aversion to something, but they might not know exactly what they want. And it's just a matter of us kind of like pulling that out of them and helping them articulate it. So what I might do to start in a situation like that is ask the student, last time you were in a situation where you felt the same way, where you were like, I have no idea what direction I want to head or what I want to do. How did you ultimately make that decision? And if they can reflect on that and like walk you through the process, then I would try to give them like an advice or an action step that's similar, but like makes sense for this scenario. I've tried that with some students and they say, I've never had to make a decision like this before, which there's always an exception. But in those situations, I might try to ask them questions that are like adjacent to the question of what do you want to help them build up to what do you want. So some examples of that might be, what do you not want? So to kind of like eliminate possibilities and then bring the scope down to a smaller scope. I might also ask them, what are like pieces of what you want? So some students might know, like, I want to work not at a desk, but I don't know what industry I want to work in. So that's progress. That's something that can help them. I also might ask them what information would be helpful for you to determine what you want. And if they can answer that question, then I can maybe guide them to that information. So there's no perfect approach, but those are some of the ways that I try to get around that like deer in headlights kind of like, I don't know, reaction.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that. The what I don't want question is one I don't use very often, but I think that's a good one because certainly that resonates with my own decision-making processes over the course of my life. So that's definitely a good one. So I guess another question maybe in some ways related to it, because you talked a little bit earlier about inconsistent information or mythological information. Do you have any suggestions for how to ask questions rather than just provide data that will help students think about ways that maybe their parents or their friends are leading them in the wrong direction?
Yes, another really good question. And I think that's an important one to talk about because we know that growing up, a lot of the sources where students get their information about careers and possibilities is from family and friends. And so a lot of them, their foundational understanding of the job world is from their family. And I think that my approach in that scenario is often to ask them just kind of straight to the point at the beginning, like, what are your sources? Like, where are you getting this information? And not to ask them in like a way to make them defensive, but say, oh, it sounds like you know a lot about what it's like to be a lawyer. How did you learn all of that? And incorporate it into more of a conversation. And if they say like, oh, well, only my mom has ever talked to me about being a lawyer, you might say, well, don't you think it would be nice to have, other perspectives on what it's like? And I think you can kind of grow from there. And most students will also like recognize that if they start talking about it out loud as well. But that's, I would say, the kind of initial direct approach that I would take. I, though, have often also asked that question and had students say like, well, I don't know, I've just like known it forever. And it's like, okay, well, that's not super helpful, but fine. Then I might offer a little bit more of a, I guess, another resource and say, when I am researching careers as a career coach or as an advisor, these are some of the resources I use. And I think that they're very helpful to get more like aggregated information about these industries. And I think that would be really helpful for you in, firming up your decision or something like that. And then I might ask them, do you think a resource like this would be helpful? Would you like to talk to someone in the field? Can we set up an informational interview? And really just try to open their mind to the possibility of like taking into account these other resources. So again, it's something that really depends on the individual student, but I know that navigating conversations about like those familial relationships can be tricky.
Thanks.
You're very welcome. All right, so I know we only have a couple minutes left in our chat for today. So I'm going to go through these last couple of slides. And in the meantime, I am going to send a view only link of the presentation in the chat. So feel free to open that up and save it if you'd like. But on the following slide in this section, I do have 3 other scenarios that I want to provide with all of you. So if you want a chance to kind of practice, if this were to happen to me, how would I approach this from an advisor perspective? How would I approach this from a counseling perspective? How would I approach this from a coaching perspective? And maybe which of those 3 would be most effective? I want to leave these here for you. I'm not going to have us go through them together, but just know that here on slide number, whatever this is, you can maybe come back if you want to kind of try applying these different methods. Also, the last section of the presentation, like I mentioned earlier, does touch a little bit on ethics in coaching because that is super important. It is a field where we are dealing with other humans and we want to make sure we're doing so in an ethical way. So on this slide, I have some of the core tenets of what it means to be a board certified coach. So as part of my training, I had to read through this ethics code of ethics, which is hyperlinked here, and kind of agree to it, sign it. And these are the 4 kind of main pieces of it. So if you decide to kind of take a coaching approach, these are some things I would recommend reviewing just to make sure you are being very diligent in using your coaching approach. And then lastly, I do have a next step slide here at the end about what you might be able to do after this presentation. So review the slides, review the linked resources, try out some of these coaching techniques and see where they're working for you, where they're not working for you, and feel free to circle back with me. Also let the Career Everywhere team or the Career Champion team know what other trainings might be helpful, because we're happy to do more on topics that folks are interested in. And then if you're a reader, I do have a book that I can recommend if you want to really dive more into coaching. It's this book that's this picture here at the bottom. It's called The Complete Handbook of Coaching, written by Elaine Cox, Tatiana Bakarova, and David Clutterbuck. They are some fairly big names in the field, and I think that their book is very digestible compared to some of the more academic content about coaching out there, which is great. It's just, if you're looking to get started, I think that this is a good place to get started. So I hope that this has been helpful for everyone. I know we're just about at 1 o'clock. I will hang out for just a second if anybody has any final questions, but if not, I will turn it back over to the Career Everywhere team to close us out for today.
All right, so thank you so much, Lisa. That was incredible. And everybody is thanking you also in the chat because that was such a great session. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I am going to throw a link to our fall schedule for the remainder of our trainings, as well as our welcome sessions. If you're just joining the Career Champion program, we encourage you to attend. But we'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lisa. It was great. And have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.